very much, Diana. Welcome. Thank you very much. Is this working correctly now? Because before we started, they told us to put the microphone at this distance. Please let me know if my audio gets lost. I have a 37-year-old colleague there, whose name is Luis, who will let me know. It is a pleasure to be here with you, to be listening to you, and it's a pleasure to spend some time with you here and be present to this culture session. I thought that perhaps I should have been more on the ecological part, but the truth of the matter is that there is no human ecology without a culture, and there is no culture without human ecology. A long time ago, several decades ago, when Bremen Williams, he wrote a keyword, which was culture in English, and he said that it has its origin agriculture, but I think that just like David's presentation ended, we're talking about the centrality of the production of food, putting our hand in the earth, being in the earth, and being in a relationship to other beings, the rest of the living beings that vary in different ontologies, whatever they are, and all the living world. So, for me, we can't talk about culture without there being earth and a living world and beings of many classes, of different classifications and senses and experiences of worlds. I've changed the title of my presentation, Living Worlds, Rhizomatic Relationships, Social Movements, Resistance, and Cultural Resurgences. This is what I want to use to talk about the relationship between culture and degrowth. I also have to share the truth. The real truth is that I have been astonished. I have not been able to sleep because all of a sudden I discovered that I was not paying so much attention to certain campaigns. Like Marichu, I paid attention to it, but not to the others. So all of a sudden, I was using the word regeneration. Renato Leduc, those in Mexico will understand it. Renato Leduc uses it. Many indigenous women use it. A lot of people everywhere talk about reviving the cultural and ecological world are using it. I don't want to give it up, but I looked for another word that perhaps provides the same sense with a different sound, just not to get into trouble with one side or with the other. So here I am using resurgence, which is so close to, I like it. I like the word. I want to try to understand how the autonomous territories of several classes, as I have said, in many parts, how the autonomous territories can give us not models, but examples of coexisting, of new cultures in the process of being made, or millenary cultures that are in the process of resurging, re-emerging. If it's a spring, for instance, it didn't come out of the blue. A spring comes from water that comes from very far, from a limestone mountain, for instance. It can come from a river in a limestone area like Yucatan, and all of a sudden it emerges upwards with a lot of energy, with a lot of movement. This is how in time, not only in geography but in time, there are carp spring, resurgence, that seem to be the same, but they come from afar and they're connected to many more. And I think that this can give us a way to rethink of what's happening and where we can look at, to feel together. And it doesn't tell us that, this is doing, feeling together, and this is how coexistence happens. And if we make it conscious in living worlds, we're also thinking with many more than just being human beings. This is how we live, and this is how we have to continue thinking or doing. I also want to point something out. Some of us that I'm here in a conversation with, in some seminaries and in some discussions in Chiapas, they're talking not only about social movements, but we need to talk about peoples in motion. And many of them are peoples in motion that are intertwined and even more and more. And if there is a local, global community convergence that now is happening for something that could be thought of as degrowth and resurgence, and look for coexisting, obeying the conditions of the earth, of the living world, I believe that this is because of this, that the peoples in motion should not necessarily be indigenous, to be peoples in motion, and they don't have to be recognized as an NGO or as an organization or as a social movement, which is underneath, and sometimes it is done on purpose, sometimes by need and rhizomatic, and sometimes we're very blind to many other positions. So we need to look to getting committed to the movement of peoples in motion, to making our own peoples in motion and getting intertwined and starting to feel and think together. I like the idea of resurgence. I was not able to understand it. I didn't find it properly in translation programs, and fortunately this emerged. This is a term in Spanish that's it's a hydrological term. Has to do with water. The abrupt and sonorous reappearance as a spring of the waters of a river or a spring absorbed in limestone terrains. And this is not just a karstic, a natural limestone terrain. This is a city. This city is a limestone type of land. It's got a lot of infrastructural inertia, a lot of people, a lot of movement, a lot of sense of life, living worlds. They're immersed and have sometimes being absorbed or hidden in this sedimented terrains in many senses. It's not easy to get out of all this, just to come up with this idea overnight, but they're re-emerging. In New York, there is an organization called Justice in the Hood. They signed some of their documents saying in the Zapatista land in New York, in a New York neighborhood, they're working on lodging. Is that ecological? Of course it is. If it was a deer, and their psychologists, conservationists say, yeah, if you talk about a deer, then that's ecological. But if we're human beings and we have nowhere to live, or the place where we live is not healthy, is not inhabitable, of course it is an ecological matter. And if we are to degrow, we need to pay attention. We have to bear in mind all these infrastructural elements, all these things that are built, that are like this city, which is based not only on forests, rivers, corals, and rivers, or whatever. We need to comprise a human ecology that takes into account every human being and every living being, their things, their artifacts, their technologies. If these entities are not thought of together, we're not reflecting our reality. We cannot see only we cannot only look at consumption, or we cannot only think about these matters from isolated economies. And so, thinking about, instead of polygons, instead of administrative zones on maps, political units, official social units, we should be thinking instead of networks with roots. That's liberating in many senses and allows to think of how these networks of humans from other human beings and things. And rivers, for me, they're living beings. The sea is a living being as well. If we think about all this together, and if we think how they're enrooted, how they're in places, and how they get together in that place, then we're thinking about feminist political ecology, cultural, political, and biological connections, and in related ontologies, relational ontologies. The world is made up of relationships. We do not have inventories of things like the famous list of spices that come from the 18th century or somewhere there. And we do not only think of energetic terms. I studied with Howard Durham. That was a moment of nostalgia when you show your diagrams, but this is not also about thinking only of energy systems and circulation of energy. This is more about thinking of relationships of many classes per se, different networks of relationships. The problem is not the thread, but the way we embroider it. We're talking about the logic of relationships, and what you said about accompanying Zapatista women for decades, that's the same. I've been lucky enough to walk next to a lot of people and being with them. Imagine, I've been studying them. Sometimes I'm their student, but sometimes I'm reconsidering everything from my own experience and on my connection with them. So, relational ontologies. There's also relational epistemologies. The world is known for and from relationships, and if this is true, this means this is from where we are and how we establish a relationship. It is difficult for me to say this in Spanish. I mean, the idea of being, in English I just speak about being, not about ser o estar. It's about being different or living differently, living it in a very different way. So from the relationships in any place, if we start to see things differently and we start to understand them. And for a moment we talk, how am I doing with time, Luis? We talk about different classes of relationships, of intersectionalities, dualities, relationalities in general. These are some of the dualities that are messing up with us, but we can't face the problems that we're touching upon degrowth if we do not face these ontological and epistemological problems of these dualities, separations, and deconnections. There's not only connections, but also deconnections, and we're suffering from a pest of deconnections in the dominating cultures. Next. Also bad connections that we would like to cut off. Not every connection is pretty. Now we can also think of vital connections, just like Gustavo has said when he talked about autonomy and autonomy. Autonomies somehow takes us to the world. We were born in autonomy with its own relationships, a given ontology that was fixed for us. And then, if we get to autonomies, we can change the ontology per se, or change where we are and from where we want to continue living or build another one. There are many built connections, instrumental connections, constructed and chosen connections. I'm thinking of everything in terms of autonomies and autonomies, thanks to Gustavo's contribution in the new Latin American Dictionary of Degrowth. Well, oftentimes we talk about the number of connections, the formal structures of connections, what's core, what's peripheral, who's at the core of it all. In terms of connections, I'm more interested in them. Are they voluntary? Are they a demand? Are they mandatory? Are they an obligation for a third party, for two people to get related? We are intertwined with connections, and almost never do we look for the terms of the connections to understand the power relationship within the networks. We treat the networks as though they were powerless. That's crazy. And then there is the quality of the connections. Let us go. Let us move on. We're about to finish. Next. Terms. This, I believe, is the most important. We can be talking about power with, power against, power over. Power over means domination. Power against means resistance. Power with means solidarity. But there's also power in spite of, next to, underneath, and from the cracks on so many walls in life. The Zapatistas talk a lot these days about the storm, about the walls, and luckily enough about the cracks on them. I'm north and south. I come from a place where there are cracks, small caves underneath, and not until they get filled, the caves in, not the caves in Yucatan, but it is that the places in between other things, in between categories, give some of us as much freedom as possible to do ourselves and to create other worlds. And I already said this. Thank you. I'm not going to talk about that. Let's skip it. Where are you? You took everything away. Luis, I can't see from here with these glasses. Okay, next. I'm going to finish with this because I think I'm running out of time, right? But I'm going to finish by saying that the dualistic model of production and reproduction, okay? And these models of completely separated categories of culture and nature, etc., are based on privatized relationships between humans and then humans and non-humans, and between and among ourselves and the living world. That's also based on the displacement and enrootment of different contexts of life. We're talking about territory, networks with roots, with culture. Territory again, and there is no culture without a territory. There's not a territory without a culture. Neither one or the other exist without the earth, without the land, without the living world. And now we're, I believe, in a position to look to do these resurgences and to substitute hierarchies, patriarchal hierarchies and economic hierarchies and class hierarchies by something horizontal. There's something else, and a lot has been said about this, and I think that is the strongest challenge for all of us with what we're doing here as a shared matter in this room. I mean, our concerns. I'm talking about the relationship not only to create viable horizontal relationships, because it's not easy, not at all. I mean, we are, or if we are, or we were born in the dominating cultures, and we can't forget about surviving in the capitalism, being autonomies. This point, I mean, we need to have schools. There are schools in many places, and we need to attend them. We need to go to them, whether this is the Zapatista school or the Kurt school or whatever. We need to know how to manage the encounter between the horizontal and the hierarchy, the state and autonomies, between the military and the guys on the streets. They're now labeling all those who protest for Black Lives Matters, for example, and for all those who protest or this anti-fascism, they're being labeled as terrorists. So just imagine that. So we have to understand how to work on this connection between horizontality and hierarchies, and rather than surviving, resurging. Thank you.